Welcome back to DM Gives Inspiration. This episode is all about damage types, and also resistances, vulnerabilities, and immunity. Technically, this information is in the player's handbook, though of course it falls to the DM to be the master of the rules. So let's start back with your player's weapons. The simple and martial weapons have 3 damage types: bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing. Bludgeoning is on weapons like clubs, flails, mauls, warhammers, things that go bump. This would also be that improvised table leg or the whole table, as well as a rock that's been thrown, and as such, a sling is a simple ranged weapon that deals 1d4 bludgeoning damage. You might also associate bludgeoning damage with fall damage. Creatures take 1d6 bludgeoning damage for every 10 feet that they fell, to a maximum of 20d6. But we're talking about weapon damage bludgeoning right now. I'll return to that topic in a little bit. Slashing damage is on things like hand axes, sickles, great axes, halberds, long swords, great swords, weapons that go swish swish, except for the whip, which is also slashing damage, and you can imagine because it slashes something open, even though the sound effect would be quite different. Much like the rock example, a thrown slashing damage still does slashing damage. So a long sword, thrown, still deals 1d8 slashing damage. If you load up a long sword into a large trebuchet in such a way that it would pierce, pointy end first, into something, that would still be slashing damage unless house ruled otherwise. Because if you don't want to do slashing damage, you should just use a different type of weapon altogether. Such as the dagger is piercing damage. Do daggers go slash slash? Yes, in the player's imaginations. However, mechanically, they will always be 1d6 piercing damage, a stab if you will. Piercing damage is something we associate heavily with the ranged weapons, crossbows, darts, short bows, long bows. But it's also on things like the javelin, the spear, the rapier, the warpick, even as wide as it may be at the end, the lance. But also, short swords are piercing, which is an important distinction. Short swords, piercing, long swords, great swords, slashing. If you're fighting mostly humanoids in your campaign, these sort of damage types will rarely come up. They are more flavor to help the player and you as DM describe what's going on. However, certain monsters have resistances, vulnerabilities, and immunities to the types of damage that these weapons deal. And let's start with resistances, as this is the most common damage type of defense you're going to see on your monster stat block. You would see this below their stats, above their senses. The monster stat block will say, damage resistances, and then list the damage types they are resistant to. The player's handbook says, if a creature or an object has resistance to damage type, the damage of that type is halved against it. So if you have a creature like the challenge rating 2 Grick, whose monster stat block says damage resistances, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical attacks, it means any damage done by player weapons will be halved. 20 bludgeoning damage from a flail becomes 10 bludgeoning damage. 21 bludgeoning damage becomes 10 bludgeoning damage. Always round down to the nearest whole number, regardless of the size of the fraction. This means that if our Grick was to receive a damage of 1, it would be 0. Because half of 1.5 is rounded down to 0. This would also be the same on the player's end for a Raging Barbarian. There is no minimum damage in 5th edition, but a 0 damage attack is still hit, so if there's any other effects with that damage, those would still happen. For instance, the attack also applied poisoned. Well, it wasn't a big enough wound to cause physical HP damage, but the poison still got in through the scratch. Now let's get a little messy. Because you'll also note that it says damage resistance, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical attacks. Well, naturally, if the attack was magical, it would deal full damage. The level 6 spell Blade Barrier deals 60-10 slashing damage. This is made by magical swords. Magical, full damage. The level 5 spell Big B's Fist, also called Arcane Hand if you're using open source materials, deals bludgeoning damage with the Grasping Hand feature. And the level 5 spell Insect Plague creates a 20-foot sphere of insects that bite and deal 4d10 piercing damage. But let's go deeper. It says damage resistance, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical attacks. If it's not an attack, the Grick doesn't have resistance to it, which means fall damage, though it may be bludgeoning, is not halved by this resistance. A Grick in a collapsing cave would not be resistant to that bludgeoning damage. That attack's text makes all the difference. An important distinction, Barbarian Rage gives resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. So a barbarian is resistant to fall damage or the collapse of a cave. But magical attacks are not just spells. A magic weapon is a magical attack. In that way, a +1 flail would deal full damage, which is mentioned there in the text. Weapon uncommon, you have a +1 to attacks and damage rolls made with this magic weapon. Any sort of enchantment is a magic weapon, even if it doesn't deal bonus damage. So the vicious weapon, when you roll a 20 on your attack roll with this magic weapon, the target takes an extra 7 damage of this weapon's type. Regardless of if they roll a 20 or not, that weapon is now enchanted, it is now magical, and would deal full damage to the Grick. Again, we note the Barbarian, who just says they have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, regardless of its magical properties. Damage resistances to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical attacks is the most common resistance you'll see in the game. It is on a lot of creatures, a lot of monstrosities. These are great creatures to make a big deal about when your players face them for the first time. They're an excellent way to highlight that your players may need to spend their money, or that they'll soon be receiving upgrades that'll counteract this problem. But for now, it's going to be a very large part of their combat planning. In that way, take advantage of it early, because once they have magical weapons, this feature will be disappearing from your monsters, and their challenge rating won't be worth as much anymore. Vulnerabilities are actually quite rare in D&D. In fact, the developers learned a lesson in 4th edition where they gave out Radiant vulnerability to nearly all the undead. It trivialized them. Players, after receiving a Radiant weapon or learning Radiant spells, never had to adapt their tactics. The player's handbook says, if a creature or object has vulnerability to a damage type, damage of that type is doubled against it. For instance, the skeleton has damage vulnerabilities, bludgeoning. Not attacks, not magical, any bludgeoning damage. Weapons, falls, spells, deals bonus damage to crack up those bones. But this theming is often kept as brief as possible. It would make perfect sense for our skeleton to have resistance to piercing damage, as spears, arrows, and our short swords are stabbed through and hit nothing, get caught in rib cages. But that's not the case. They just wanted to theme the skeleton with this bludgeoning attribute, so bludgeoning damage is increased. Players will take immediate note of vulnerabilities. With resistances, you might say, the armor's thick, you feel like you did less damage, or maybe you straight up say, that 8 is now a 4, and they think to themselves, that's kinda weird. And don't really change their attacks. But your cleric walks up to a skeleton with its mace and swings for 8 damage and you say that's 16. They will never use another weapon type on skeletons again. And in that way, incorporate it into your story. Make a big deal about it. They're going to go to a graveyard full of skeletons? The priest giving them that quest hands them the mace, or they get to borrow the mace from the church. But D&D is a game of math, and a situation might arrive where something is both resistant and vulnerable to the same damage type. As such, the resistance is applied first, and then the vulnerability would double the damage. For instance, if you home ruled that these skeletons were once barbarians, and they're currently raging, you would first give resistance to 21 bludgeoning damage down to 10, and then vulnerability that damage back up to 20. Important to note, because if you did it in the wrong order, you'd actually end up with 21 damage in the end again. And while we're having this crunchy discussion on numbers, if there was ever an ability such as a magical effect that reduced damage by a set amount, such as an aura they were standing in, that specialty reduction would apply first, and then you would do the resistance and vulnerability math. Resistances and vulnerabilities only apply once. If, for instance, a monster had resistance to slashing damage, and by some means had a ring that gave it resistance to slashing damage, that would be just a single instance of resistance. The damage would be halved. Same thing with vulnerability. If a creature is vulnerable to bludgeoning damage, and a spell or effect made it vulnerable again to bludgeoning damage, it would still just be one instance of double damaged vulnerability. Immunities will also be listed in this section, but nowhere in the Dungeon Master's Guide or the Player's Handbook does it describe what an immunity is. You just know they're immune if it says it. Immune means it takes no damage from that damage type. It can be rather self-explanatory when it gets to the elements. A fire elemental is naturally immune to fire damage. But a werewolf has damage immunities, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical attacks that aren't silvered. Now, if you have a printed monster manual, it may say something slightly different, such as from non-magical attacks or weapons that aren't silvered. Or in the case of mine here, it says non-magical attacks not made with a silver weapon. It all means the same thing. The keywords are still the same. A magic weapon would deal full damage to a werewolf rather than none. A silvered mundane weapon would deal full damage to a werewolf. And as it says, attacks, just like our Grick, it would take full damage from falling or being crushed in a cave-in. At challenge rating 3, your players may not have access to magical weapons. Even using sane pricing for magical weapons, the cheapest you can get is that vicious magical weapon at 400 gold pieces. Silvering a weapon instead costs 100 gold pieces. Naturally, it would be unfair to send your players, particularly your martial classes, into a battle to the death versus a werewolf. You have to work that theming in the stat block into your story. For instance, the first fight with a werewolf ends when they take a certain amount of damage. Make a big deal about how immune they are to the bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, and only the spells are working. Then it runs away. They would go about gathering information and eventually those silvered weapons to use, whether by crafting, gifts from the town, or questing for one. Doing that sort of investigation and discovery in an organic way is naturally very time-consuming. You would want this werewolf showdown to be the end of a 2 or 3 session story. You're also battling pop culture here, so the mystery of gaining a silvered weapon to defeat the werewolf won't actually be that mysterious. If you're doing more of a Monster of the Week style campaign, then letting your players do a knowledge check before the fight starts might be the best way to handle this. A simple arcane, nature, or history check could reveal the upcoming monster's resistances, vulnerabilities, or immunities. And of course, worth noting again in our order of operations here, immunity cancels out any vulnerabilities or resistances that might be had. There simply is 0 damage, so you don't times it or divide it by anything. Embrace these resistances, vulnerabilities, and immunities as puzzles for your players. And the DM presents a themed puzzle. It's up to the players to use math and mechanics to solve it. Describe how your players' weapons aren't piercing the werewolf's thick skin. It might take multiple instances of battle, or even NPCs telling them about these resistances and vulnerabilities for them to catch on, particularly if they're heavily themed in roleplay. If the DM goes too crunchy, if the DM is the one saying the mechanics and math aloud directly to the players, things can start showing their seams, such as the ochre jelly. The ochre jelly, a large ooze, is immune to slashing. Now this is because it has a special ability that whenever it receives slashing damage, it splits in half. The players are cutting it up and it multiplies. A very cool monster, very dangerous. But if you tell your players directly that it's the slashing damage that does it, the mystery's solved. In this instance, you would trick your players. They swing for 2d6 slashing, you write it down. You don't minus the monster's hit points, but you write it down. Make them think it's working. That's more pseudopod attacks for you and a way more dangerous monster. If the players catch on, they'd rather stab with their sword, piercing damage, or bludgeon with the side of their sword, bludgeoning damage. That isn't rules as written for the great sword they're using, but you might reward that strategy and house rule it. There are many other types of damage than those that are dealt by the simple or martial player weapons, and we'll talk about those on a future episode. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe on whatever podcast service you're using, and share the show with your friends and across the web. The show is supported by the patrons over at patreon.com/Kyle Fergusson, 2 S's in Fergusson. Music was by Brian Griffith. And I'll see you all next week with more inspiration on DM Gives Inspiration.